When the judge delivers a guilty verdict and the courtroom empties, most people believe the process has reached its end. The sentence has been handed down, the case is closed, and justice, at least in the eyes of the public, has been served. But for the person standing in shackles, the verdict is not the conclusion of the story. It is the beginning of a far more complex and often hidden system that will determine the rest of their life. The moment the courtroom doors close, control quietly shifts away from judges, prosecutors, and juries. Decisions that will shape an inmate's daily reality, where they will be held, how they will be treated, and what level of danger they will face, are no longer made in public. They are handled behind the scenes by administrative systems most Americans never see and rarely understand. This phase of incarceration is not decided by emotion, sympathy, or even justice in the way most people define it. Instead, it is driven by classifications, internal risk scores, security assessments, and bureaucratic procedures that reduce a human being to a file, a number, and a threat level. These decisions are made quickly, often without explanation, and once they are finalized, they are extremely difficult to reverse. Two people can receive the same sentence for similar crimes and yet be sent to completely different types of prisons. One may enter a facility where movement is allowed, programs exist, and communication with family is possible. The other may be sent to a high-security institution where isolation is routine, violence is normalized, and survival becomes a daily calculation. The difference between those outcomes often has nothing to do with the crime itself. Behind the scenes, classification officers analyze an inmate's criminal history, age, alleged affiliations, past behavior, psychological evaluations, and even perceived future risk. In some systems, algorithmic scoring tools are used to assign security levels. In others, human discretion plays a role, but always within rigid institutional guidelines. Once a placement decision is made, it sets off a chain reaction that affects everything from housing assignments to access to medical care. What makes this system especially powerful is its invisibility. Inmates are rarely told how their placement was decided. Families are given little information, and the public almost never sees the process unfold. By the time an inmate arrives at their assigned facility, the decision has already been made, documented, and locked into the system. For many inmates, the most dangerous moment of incarceration is not the arrest or the trial. It is the transfer. Moving from local jail to state or federal custody exposes them to uncertainty, long transports, temporary holding facilities, and environments where violence is common and oversight is minimal. Some inmates spend weeks or months in transit, unsure where they are going or why. This system is not designed to explain itself. It is designed to function efficiently, to manage risk, and to maintain control. But efficiency often comes at a human cost. Placement decisions can separate inmates from their families by hundreds or thousands of miles. They can place vulnerable individuals into hostile environments, and they can determine whether an inmate will spend their sentence attempting rehabilitation or simply trying to survive. The phrase, doing time, suggests a passive experience, but the reality is far more active and unforgiving. From the moment the verdict is delivered, every movement is tracked, every classification recorded, and every decision logged. Inmates quickly learn that their future is no longer shaped by what they say in court, but by how the system interprets who they are. This documentary examines what happens after the verdict, the stage of incarceration that is rarely discussed but deeply consequential. We follow the path from sentencing to intake, from classification to final placement, and expose the mechanisms that decide where inmates are sent and why. Because once the verdict is read, the courtroom fades away, and the prison system takes over. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The moment a judge delivers a verdict, the public process of justice officially ends. Cameras stop rolling, spectators leave the courtroom, and the legal drama that unfolded over weeks or months disappears from view. But for the person who has just been convicted, the most consequential phase of the entire process is only beginning. Once the verdict is entered into the record, the inmate is no longer treated as a defendant. They become a custody responsibility. From this point forward, decisions about their life are handled almost entirely by correctional systems rather than courts. This shift happens quickly and quietly, often within minutes of sentencing. In most cases, the inmate is immediately taken into secure holding. This may be a courthouse holding cell, a county jail intake unit, or a temporary detention area, depending on the jurisdiction. At this stage, the inmate may not know where they are going next, how long they will stay, or what kind of facility they will ultimately be sent to. What they do know is that they are no longer in control. Behind the scenes, paperwork begins moving faster than the inmate ever will. Court clerks transmit sentencing documents. Warrants of commitment are issued. Corrections departments receive formal notice that a new inmate has entered the system. These documents trigger a standardized but powerful chain of events that determines everything that follows. One of the first steps is legal classification. This is not about guilt or innocence. That question has already been settled. Legal classification determines whether the inmate falls under county, state, or federal jurisdiction and what authority now has custody over them. This decision alone can change the entire trajectory of incarceration. A person sentenced to a short term may remain in a local jail. Someone sentenced to years or life will be transferred into a larger system with multiple facilities, security levels, and internal rules. Federal inmates enter a completely different structure than state inmates, with separate classification systems and placement criteria. Within hours or days, the inmate is entered into a corrections database. From this point on, the system begins building a profile that will follow them for the rest of their sentence. This profile includes criminal history, sentence length, age, prior incarcerations, known behavioral issues, and sometimes information that the inmate may never realize is being used to judge them. This is where many inmates first realize that the sentence itself is only part of the punishment. The conditions under which that sentence will be served are decided by people they will likely never meet. Correctional officers and intake staff are not tasked with fairness in the moral sense. Their responsibility is control, safety, and risk management. Every inmate is evaluated based on how much of a threat they are believed to pose, to staff, to other inmates, and to institutional order. This evaluation often begins before the inmate even leaves the courthouse. Past disciplinary records, prior arrests, alleged gang affiliations, and even unproven intelligence reports can influence how the inmate is flagged in the system. In some cases, inmates are labeled as high risk before they ever step foot inside a prison. The inmate themselves is rarely given a clear explanation of what is happening. Questions about placement are often met with vague responses or no answers at all. At this stage, uncertainty is part of the process. The system does not prioritize transparency, it prioritizes efficiency. As hours turn into days, the inmate may be transferred to a county jail if they were not already held there. For many, this is the first stop in a long and unpredictable journey. County jails are not designed for long-term housing, yet inmates can remain there for weeks or months while classification decisions are made. During this time, inmates often experience a psychological shift. The trial is over. There are no more court dates to prepare for, no more attorneys to speak with regularly. What replaces that structure is waiting for transport, waiting for paperwork, waiting to be told where they are going. This waiting period is one of the most stressful phases of incarceration. Inmates are surrounded by rumors, speculation, and fear. Some hear stories about brutal facilities. Others are warned about prisons where violence is constant or where isolation is extreme. With no official information, imagination fills the gaps. Family members experience a similar sense of helplessness. Phone calls may be limited or cut off entirely. Visits may stop without warning. Loved ones often have no idea where the inmate is being held or when they will be moved. The system offers little reassurance. What makes this moment especially powerful is how final it feels. Once an inmate is formally transferred out of local custody and into the broader prison system, their ability to influence their own placement becomes extremely limited. Appeals and legal motions may still exist, but they operate on a separate timeline that rarely affects day-to-day confinement. From the system's perspective, this phase is routine. Thousands of inmates pass through it every week across the United States. But for each individual, it represents a complete loss of autonomy. Decisions are no longer explained. Choices are no longer offered. Compliance becomes survival. This is the moment where incarceration becomes real, not as an abstract sentence, but as a physical, psychological, and environmental reality. The inmate is no longer defined by their case number or courtroom arguments. They are defined by how the prison system categorizes them, and that categorization will decide where they go next. Long before an inmate ever sees the inside of a prison cell, the system has already begun deciding where they belong. This decision is not random, and it is not based solely on the crime committed. It is the result of a classification process designed to measure risk, predict behavior, and maintain institutional control. Classification is the backbone of the American prison system. It exists to answer one central question: what kind of inmate is this person believed to be? The answer to that question determines nearly everything that follows. At its core, classification is a sorting mechanism. Inmates are grouped based on perceived threat levels, security needs, and management concerns. The goal is not rehabilitation or fairness, it is containment. Every inmate must be placed somewhere the system believes they can be controlled with the least amount of disruption. Once an inmate enters the correctional system, a classification file is created. This file is far more influential than most inmates realize. It follows them from facility to facility and often remains unchanged for years, even when circumstances shift. The classification process begins with risk assessment. Correctional agencies collect data points that are fed into internal scoring systems. These data points include the severity of the offense, sentence length, prior convictions, history of violence, escape attempts, and institutional behavior if the inmate has been incarcerated before. Age also plays a role. Younger inmates are often viewed as more volatile and physically capable, while older inmates may be considered lower risk, but not always. Psychological evaluations can influence scores, particularly if an inmate is flagged as unpredictable or resistant to authority. In many jurisdictions, alleged gang affiliation carries enormous weight. Even unverified intelligence, such as information from confidential informants or prior law enforcement databases, can place an inmate into a higher security category. Once labeled, it is extremely difficult to remove that designation. What makes this system especially powerful is that it is not transparent. Inmates are rarely shown their full classification score or told exactly how it was calculated. They may know the result, minimum, medium, or maximum security, but not the reasoning behind it. Security levels are more than labels. A minimum security facility may allow movement, work programs, education, and contact visits. A maximum security prison operates under a completely different reality: restricted movement, constant supervision, and heightened tension. Supermax facilities take this even further, emphasizing isolation and control over interaction. 1-point difference in a classification score can determine whether an inmate spends their sentence in relative stability or constant restriction. Yet these scores are often calculated quickly, based on incomplete information, and rarely revisited unless a major incident occurs. Human discretion still exists within the system, but it operates inside rigid boundaries. Classification officers are trained to err on the side of caution. If there is uncertainty, higher security is usually chosen. From the system's perspective, overclassification is safer than underclassification. This creates a structural bias toward harsher placements. Once an inmate is placed in a high-security environment, their behavior there is often used to justify keeping them in that environment. Isolation, stress, and constant surveillance can trigger disciplinary infractions, which then reinforce the original classification. Inmates quickly learn that classification is not just an entry process. It is a cycle. Every report, every write-up, every interaction with staff feeds back into the system. A single incident can delay reclassification reviews for years. The psychological impact of this system is significant. Inmates may feel trapped not just physically, but administratively. Appeals are possible, but they move slowly and rarely succeed without clear documentation or legal intervention. Families are often unaware of how much power classification holds. They may assume placement is based on geography or availability, not realizing that internal risk scores outweigh proximity to home. As a result, inmates can be sent hundreds or thousands of miles away from their support systems. From the system's standpoint, classification works. It creates order. It reduces unpredictability. It allows prisons to function at scale. But from the inmate's perspective, it is a black box. one that decides their fate without explanation or consent. By the time an inmate receives notice of their assigned facility, the decision has already been finalized. There is no courtroom argument, no jury, no public record, just a number, a score, and a destination. And once that destination is set, the next phase begins. Once classification decisions are finalized, the inmate enters one of the most dangerous and least understood phases of incarceration: transfer. This stage rarely appears in public discussions about prison life, yet it is where uncertainty, vulnerability, and risk reach their peak. Transfer is not a single event. It is a process, often slow, fragmented, and disorienting, that moves inmates from local custody into long-term confinement. For many, this period is marked by confusion, exhaustion, and a complete loss of information about what comes next. After classification assigns a security level and target facility, the inmate is placed on a transport list. At this point, timelines become unpredictable. Some inmates are moved within days. Others wait weeks or even months, sitting in county jails never designed for extended confinement. County jails serve as holding hubs during this phase. They are overcrowded, under-resourced, and focused on short-term detention, not long-term management. Inmates waiting for transfer often have limited access to programs, restricted communication with family, and little clarity about when they will leave. The uncertainty is intentional. Movement schedules are not shared in advance. Inmates are frequently notified of transfer only hours or minutes before it happens. This reduces escape risks but increases psychological stress. Personal belongings are packed quickly. Phone calls may be cut off. Goodbyes are rushed or impossible. Transport itself varies by jurisdiction but follows similar patterns across the United States. Inmates are moved by secure vans, buses, or, in federal cases, coordinated transport systems that move prisoners across multiple states. These journeys can last days, with stops at temporary holding facilities along the way. Conditions during transport are harsh. Inmates are often shackled for long periods, seated in confined spaces, and given minimal food and water. Sleep is limited. Restrooms are controlled. Medical needs may go unaddressed until arrival. For vulnerable inmates, this phase can be physically and mentally overwhelming. Temporary holding facilities play a critical role in the transfer pipeline. These facilities act as sorting centers, housing inmates briefly while awaiting their final destination. Conditions here are often stricter than at permanent prisons. Movement is limited, information is scarce, and interactions with staff are minimal. Violence during transfer is a known risk. Inmates from different regions, gang affiliations, and security levels may be housed together temporarily. Tensions are high. Alliances are unclear. For inmates who have never been inside a prison environment, this can be their first exposure to institutional violence. What makes the transfer phase particularly dangerous is that inmates have not yet learned the rules of their future environment. They do not know which behaviors attract attention, which affiliations matter, or how to navigate institutional power structures. Mistakes made during this phase can follow them for years. Correctional systems view transfer as logistics. Inmates are inventory to be moved efficiently from one location to another. From an administrative perspective, the process is routine. From the inmate's perspective, it is destabilizing and often frightening. Family members experience this phase as silence. Phone numbers change without notice. Mail is delayed or returned. Loved ones may not know where the inmate is being held. For days or weeks, inmates can effectively disappear from public view. Transfers also solidify classification decisions. Once an inmate arrives at a facility aligned with their security level, reversing that placement becomes far more difficult. The system treats arrival as confirmation that the original assessment was correct. For many inmates, the first real understanding of their sentence comes during transfer. The abstract idea of doing time becomes concrete when shackles are tightened, transport doors close, and the destination remains unknown. This phase strips away the last illusions of control. There are no court dates to prepare for, no arguments to make, no explanations to demand. Compliance becomes mandatory, not optional. By the time the transport vehicle reaches its final destination, the inmate has already been shaped by the process. Fatigue, stress, and fear are common. Expectations are low. Survival instincts begin to take over. Because once the gates of the receiving facility open, the transfer phase ends. An intake begins. When the transport vehicle finally stops and the gates open, the inmate's journey enters a new phase. This moment, arrival at the assigned prison, is where classification decisions become physical reality. What was once paperwork and risk scores now translates into concrete walls, locked doors, and a daily routine that will define the inmate's life. Intake is the formal process through which an inmate is absorbed into a prison's internal system. It is designed for control, efficiency, and security, not comfort or explanation. The first hours inside a facility are among the most psychologically intense moments of incarceration. Upon arrival, inmates are removed from transport restraints and immediately placed under direct supervision. They are searched thoroughly. Personal property is inventoried, confiscated, or destroyed depending on institutional policy. Items considered harmless outside, paper, pens, personal clothing, are often restricted or prohibited entirely. The inmate is then issued a prison identity. This includes an inmate number, institutional clothing, and a housing assignment that may be temporary or permanent. From this point forward, names matter less than numbers. Identification is no longer personal, it is administrative. Medical screening is one of the first mandatory steps. Inmates undergo brief health evaluations to identify immediate risks, communicable diseases, or mental health concerns. These screenings are often quick and conducted under pressure. While serious conditions may be flagged, many inmates report that the process feels rushed and impersonal. Mental health assessments are also conducted, though their depth varies widely. Some facilities rely on short questionnaires. Others conduct brief interviews. The goal is not therapy, it is risk identification. Inmates perceived as unstable or unpredictable may be placed under additional observation or isolated housing. Following medical processing, inmates receive orientation, often minimal. Rules are explained rapidly. Handbooks may be issued, but comprehension is assumed rather than confirmed. Inmates are expected to learn quickly, often by observing others or through trial and error. This expectation can be dangerous. Prison rules are strict, and violations, intentional or accidental, carry consequences. New inmates who do not yet understand institutional norms are particularly vulnerable during this period. Housing assignments are one of the most critical intake decisions. Even within the same facility, conditions can vary drastically between units. Some housing areas allow limited movement and interaction. Others operate under near-constant lockdown. Assignments are influenced by classification scores, perceived affiliations, and available space. Inmates rarely have input. Requests are noted but seldom honored unless they align with institutional priorities. The psychological weight of intake is heavy. Inmates are surrounded by unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar rules, and constant noise. They must quickly assess their environment, who to avoid, who to watch, and how to blend in. Every interaction feels consequential. Correctional officers during intake are focused on order. Their role is to establish authority immediately. Commands are short. Compliance is expected without question. Hesitation can be interpreted as defiance. For many inmates, this is the first time they fully grasp the permanence of their situation. Courtrooms, jails, and transport vehicles all felt temporary. Prison does not. The routines begin immediately. Counts, meals, lockdowns, movement schedules. Family contact is often restricted during intake. Phone access may be delayed. Mail takes time to process. Inmates who arrived with the expectation of immediate communication often face silence instead. This isolation reinforces the system's control. The inmate is physically present but socially disconnected. The outside world feels distant, abstract, and unreachable. Intake also marks the beginning of institutional observation. Staff monitor behavior closely during the first days and weeks. How an inmate reacts to authority, stress, and confinement can influence future decisions, including housing stability and eligibility for programs. Mistakes made during intake, arguments, refusal to comply, conflicts with other inmates, can follow a person for years. A single report can delay reclassification reviews or justify stricter supervision. From the system's perspective, intake is successful when the inmate is processed efficiently and placed without incident. From the inmate's perspective, it is overwhelming, disorienting, and often frightening. This is where theory becomes reality. The prison is no longer an idea or a destination. It is now home. And once intake is complete, the inmate must adapt, not just to confinement, but to the unspoken rules that govern survival behind the walls. Once intake is complete and the cell door closes for the first time, the classification decision becomes permanent reality. From this moment forward, an inmate's daily life is shaped not by the judge's words in court, but by where the prison system has chosen to place them. This single decision influences safety, opportunity, mental health, and the likelihood of ever leaving prison in better condition than they entered. Prison placement determines the rhythm of existence. In lower security facilities, days may include work assignments, limited movement, education programs, and scheduled recreation. In higher security environments, life is defined by restriction. Movement is controlled. Interaction is monitored. Lockdowns are frequent. The margin for error is narrow. For inmates placed in high security or restrictive housing, survival becomes the primary objective. These environments are designed around control rather than rehabilitation. Noise levels are constant. Privacy is non-existent. Tension is built into the architecture itself. Over time, this atmosphere reshapes behavior. Every prison develops its own internal order, an unwritten code enforced not by policy manuals, but by social consequences. Inmates quickly learn that placement determines which rules matter most. In some facilities, avoiding conflict is possible. In others, avoiding conflict is interpreted as weakness. Classification decisions also dictate access to programs. Educational courses, vocational training, and treatment programs are often limited to specific security levels. An inmate placed in a higher security environment may spend years waiting for access to opportunities that are readily available elsewhere. This has long-term consequences. Participation in programs affects parole reviews, reclassification eligibility, and institutional evaluations. An inmate who wants to demonstrate progress may find themselves structurally blocked from doing so simply because of where they were placed. Family connections are also shaped by placement. Facilities located far from home make visits difficult or impossible. Phone access may be restricted. Video visitation, if available at all, often comes at a cost. Over time, relationships weaken. Support systems erode. Isolation, whether physical or social, has a cumulative psychological effect. Studies and institutional reports have consistently shown that prolonged exposure to high-control environments increases anxiety, depression, and emotional withdrawal. Inmates may become hypervigilant, distrustful, or detached. The system often interprets these changes as behavioral problems rather than environmental responses. Infractions lead to write-ups. Write-ups justify continued placement. The cycle reinforces itself. Reclassification reviews exist in theory. In practice, they are slow, infrequent, and heavily influenced by past decisions. An inmate must demonstrate sustained compliance, often over years, to be considered for lower security. One incident can reset the clock entirely. From the system's perspective, stability matters more than improvement. Moving inmates creates risk. Keeping them where they are is safer administratively. As a result, many inmates spend far longer in restrictive environments than originally intended. Some adapt by becoming invisible, following rules meticulously, avoiding attention, minimizing interaction. Others adapt by asserting dominance, aligning with groups for protection, or adopting behaviors that ensure survival in hostile settings. Neither path is without cost. What is rarely acknowledged is how early placement decisions echo through an entire sentence. A person sentenced to 10 years may experience that sentence in radically different ways depending on where they are held. One path allows for growth and structure. The other prioritizes containment and control. This is why the period after the verdict matters so deeply. The courtroom outcome sets the length of the sentence. The prison system decides the quality of that sentence. By the time years have passed, the original decision is no longer questioned. It becomes normalized. The inmate is defined by where they are, not why they were sent there. For many, release, if it ever comes, arrives after years of adaptation to an environment that was never designed to prepare them for the outside world. The habits that ensured survival inside may not translate beyond the walls. This is the hidden consequence of placement. It does not just determine where an inmate lives, it determines who they become. And once that transformation is complete, reversing it is far more difficult than making the original decision ever was. By the time the verdict is read and the courtroom empties, the public believes justice has finished its work. But what happens next is rarely questioned, rarely explained, and almost never seen. Behind the scenes, America's prison system quietly assumes control. Decisions are made without hearings, without juries, and without public oversight. Classification scores are calculated, risk levels are assigned, transfer orders are issued, and a destination is chosen, one that may define an inmate's entire sentence. This process is not shaped by drama or emotion. It is shaped by bureaucracy, by policies designed to manage millions of people efficiently, even when efficiency comes at the cost of humanity. Once an inmate enters this system, every step forward is governed by rules they did not create and cannot easily challenge. Where an inmate is sent determines far more than geography. It dictates safety, isolation, opportunity, and mental survival. It determines whether rehabilitation is possible or whether control becomes the only objective. Two people with similar sentences can live entirely different realities, based not on justice, but on classification. For families, this system often feels invisible and unforgiving. Loved ones disappear into facilities far from home. Communication becomes limited. Explanations are scarce. The system moves forward whether anyone understands it or not. And for inmates, the verdict becomes just the beginning. The real sentence is lived day by day, inside institutions designed to prioritize order over recovery. Once the placement decision is made, it echoes through every year that follows. Understanding what happens after the verdict matters. Because justice does not end with sentencing. It continues quietly, behind walls, shaped by decisions most people never see, but whose consequences last a lifetime. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.